October 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte stands in a smoke-filled peasant's hut in Gorodnia, his eyes fixed on a map that has suddenly become a death warrant. November 1941. Adolf Hitler hunches over a tactical table in the Wolf's Lair, his finger trembling over the stalled front line just miles from a Moscow he will never enter. Two conquerors, 130 years apart, staring into the same abyss. The maps have changed, but the physics of the terrain remain the same. The audio is dominated by the sudden, distinct sound of a distant, howling wind, the arrival of General Winter. Just weeks prior, both men were the self-proclaimed masters of the East, convinced that their personal will could override the laws of thermodynamics. Napoleon believed the fall of Moscow would force the Tsar to crawl for peace. Hitler was so certain of a 6-week collapse that he explicitly forbade the distribution of heavy winter gear to avoid defeatist thinking. They were operating on the delusion that they were fighting human armies, ignoring that they were invading an ecosystem programmed to reject them. The grand illusion of invincibility shattered the moment the first snowflakes fell, transforming the vast Russian steppe from a highway of conquest into a colossal open-air prison of extreme exposure. Join the ambition that drove Napoleon in 1812 and Hitler in 1941 was fueled by the same historical fire that consumed the bridges behind them. They were captured by a dual myth: the Napoleonic legend of invincible momentum and the Nazi theory of technological superiority. But the landscape had been rejecting conquerors for millennia, from the Swedish King Charles V to the Teutonic Knights. These ancient echoes are visible in the parallels both leaders failed to consult, believing their logistics could rewrite the physics of a continent's seasonal cycle. They ignored the ghost map of historical failure, assuming that their specific era of warfare would be the one to finally tame the frozen East. Napoleon and Hitler were tactical geniuses who became the master architects of their own annihilation, allowing their egos to become their primary executioners. Napoleon's vanity was his greatest general, but in the white void of the retreat, it blinded him to the necessity of a rapid withdrawal. Hitler's ideological rage transformed a tactical retreat from Stalingrad into a suicidal, stand-fast order that trapped his Sixth Army in starvation and zero-degree exposure. Both leaders were so brilliant at grand strategy that they convinced themselves they could ignore basic biological needs, placing abstract political glory above the survival of their men. They ignored the caloric and thermal realities of the common soldier, trading human lives for the illusion of an unbreakable front. They calculated that they had conquered the terrain, but they completely ignored the silent variable, the cold of a Russian winter, an active force that weaponizes every atom of the environment. In 1812, it arrived as the Râpe, a lethal combination of freezing wind and humidity that flash froze exposed flesh, shattering toes and fingers like glass. In 1941, it arrived as the Rasputitsa, the mud season that paralyzed technology, followed by a sudden plunge to -40. At these temperatures, synthetic machine oil becomes jelly, and the high tensile steel of tank treads becomes brittle, cracking under its own weight. This silent variable neutralized both 19th century horsepower and 20th century combustion engines with equal, terrifying indifference. While official bulletins argued over tactical positions, the actual history was a shadow narrative of degrading, animalistic survival. In 1812, French grenadiers, icons of glory, were reduced to trading stolen Moscow silk for a piece of horsehide or a sip of frozen sludge. In 1941, German Lancers were using frozen enemy bodies to reinforce trenches that could not be dug into the iron-hard ground. This was the reality of men reduced to basic function, where a single, intact boot was worth more than an empire's ideology. The sound of the wind howling across the steppe was the final soundtrack for those abandoned in the white drifts. The plan for both campaigns was simple: strike deep to secure resources. But the logistical reality was a 1,000-mile supply line that functioned like a stretched elastic band. In 1812, Napoleon's supply wagons were empty by the time they reached Moscow, having been systematically picked apart by Cossack partisans. In 1941, the German rail gauge did not match the Russian system, creating a bottleneck that paralyzed the flow of food and fuel. In both cases, the frozen hell proved that geography can neutralize any tactical machine that outruns its own stomach. Supply became a search for unburnt oats, or the impossible calculation of airdrop tonnage required to keep an army marginally alive. For Napoleon, October 25th was the single decision point where his empire died. Fearing the appearance of a total retreat, he hesitated and chose to turn back to the devastated Smolensk road. For Hitler, the point of no return came in November 1941, when he explicitly forbade the 4th Panzer Group from making a strategic withdrawal to defensive lines. Both moments illustrate the same fatal flaw: tactical flexibility strangled by the political pride of a dictator who could not admit he had met his match. These orders committed their armies to a battle they had already lost, not against a human enemy, but against the relentless power of the ecosystem. They chose the illusion of victory over the reality of survival, transforming their grand strategies into a forensic accounting of death. Both leaders calculated the human cost of glory, but they failed to calculate the moral cost of their arithmetic. In 1812, Napoleon calculated the loss of his invincible reputation to be more costly than the lives of 500,000 men. In 1941, Hitler viewed his soldiers not as human lives, but as industrial units expendable for political capital. This cold calculus is the ultimate horror, the transformation of military strategy into a purely forensic accounting of death. Victory was an abstract value, paid for with the very real extinction of hundreds of thousands. Inside the command structures of both forces, the friction was as intense as the biting frost. In 1812, Murat wanted a reckless charge. Davout advocated for withdrawal, and Napoleon, for the first time, fell into catatonic indecision. In 1941, General Halder confronted Hitler with logistical failure, only for Hitler to accuse his staff of schoolboy mathematics. This friction paralyzed the command. Separate corps operated with no coordination, while a paranoid dictator micromanaged from thousands of miles away. They ignored the very experts they had hired to win, sacrificing strategic reality for personal paranoia and pride. Official bulletins spoke of a strategic withdrawal, but the literal trail of unburied bodies told the true story. In 1812, the spring thaw revealed a landscape paved with dead French soldiers and horses, creating a crisis that took months to solve. At Stalingrad, the skeletal remains of the 6th Army formed a grisly perimeter that local civilians had to process and bury for years. This was the physical processing of death. Russian civilians, 130 years apart, collecting the remains of empires that had traveled thousands of miles to conquer, only to be absorbed into the very soil they sought to dominate. Modern forensic archaeology along the Smolensk road and the perimeter of Stalingrad reveals the absolute truth that official history tries to omit. At sites like the Berezina River crossing and the mass graves at Stalingrad, excavations have unearthed skeletons that tell a singular story. Thousands were buried not by bullets, but by the cold. In many graves, the remains show that soldiers died while still clutching each other for residual warmth, their bodies frozen in a final, agonizing embrace. These sites are not battlefields. They are forensic sites where the earth has preserved the evidence of an ecosystem's total, silent veto over human ambition. Imagine a single soldier, identical in his core humanity across both 1812 and 1941, as the lens focuses on his face. In 1812, he is carrying a heavy sack of Moscow's gold, only to realize he cannot eat gold when the temperature hits -30. In 1941, he is a soldier clutching a single photograph of his family, his fingers so black with frostbite that they break the photo paper. The human toll is not a number on a page. It is the absolute erasure of human identity by extreme exposure, where the grandeur of empire is reduced to the sound of a shallow, freezing breath. These dual failures didn't just end 2 campaigns. They fundamentally redrew the entire map of the human imagination and signaled the rise of Russia as a dominant power. The annihilation of the Grande Armée shattered the myth of the invincible Corsican, just as Stalingrad shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. These dual freezes created a massive geopolitical scar on time, a recursive loop of failure that defines the boundaries of European ambition. Any future leader contemplating a conquest of the East must first consult the forensic record and the silent white graveyard of their predecessors. The frozen hell is a permanent reminder that some ecosystems are simply not programmed to accept the grandeur of empire. We gaze upon the end result of both campaigns, a flat, white void of snow stretching to the horizon with no sign of human presence. History judges the victors, but the silence of the frozen hell at Smolensk and Stalingrad asks us to judge the decision itself. If you were standing in that hut in Gorodnya with the frost visible on your map, would you have risked one more battle for the illusion of victory? Or would you have turned back into the abyss, knowing you were fated to be a statistic in General Winter's final, cold forensic accounting?